meeting of May 5th, 2009 of the City of Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee to order. The subject for today is regulation of aggressive solicitation or aggressive panhandling. Sue?
Mr. Chair, I'll make the presentation, and I believe Sue may have some things she wants to say, but I thought I would begin. This ordinance draft is...
Mr. Wiley, I just wanted to remind folks that if they do want to make a public comment, to fill out a speaker's card and back and give it to Lori right here. Mr. Wiley, sorry.
This draft ordinance is before the committee at the request of the City Council by way of the Council Subcommittee on Homelessness and Community Issues. I think you will recall that last year the Council formed that subcommittee. They gave their report to the Council last October and made 12 recommendations or recommended 12 steps that the City look into. And at the request of the Council, the staff has been pursuing how we would go about implementing those 12 steps. And one of those steps clearly assigned to the City Attorney's Office was to look at the City's existing ordinance from 1992, I believe, that's called aggressive solicitations or aggressive panhandling, and to see if that ordinance could be improved upon. And I think the consensus was that there is probably a need for that. The existing city ordinance really is fairly bare bones and for the most part seems to regulate the situation where someone is panhandled or solicited and in such a way that there's actually physical contact, unwanted physical contact, or they're panhandled in such a way that they're actually in fear of their person, that the person, if you will, that's doing the panhandling is hovering over them. And I think what we've seen in recent years and what I think the subcommittee heard expressed was concern about some other conduct that we believe can be regulated. It has been by some cities, such as Santa Monica. For example, and actually this is something that started in Santa Barbara in the 1990s. With sidewalk dining was a city program. It actually came from the merchants and the restaurateurs asked for it, and the city made it possible through ordinances in the 1990s, and it's pretty successful. I think everybody enjoys it. But I don't think people typically enjoy sitting there at their meal and being solicited by a panhandler. And we believe that is something that can legally and constitutionally be regulated by the city. I'm going to get into that, the constitutional requirements, a bit in a bit more detail. But that's the sort of thing that the subcommittee heard was of a concern. We also have situations where people might be waiting in line for a movie and they're solicited. They might be at an ATM and they're solicited for money, might be waiting for a bus. Similarly, and for the most part, I think we're talking about State Street, which of course in Santa Barbara is a very popular and as a result crowded area of the city at times. And there does seem to be a need for some regulations. For example, if we get someone soliciting, verbally soliciting and monopolizing the use of a bench on State Street for that purpose, the city might want to regulate that. Santa Monica has an area called the 3rd Street Mall, and last fall they amended their ordinances to regulate the use of benches for basically long-term use of benches for solicitation purposes. I think it might be good for me just to spend a minute or two talking about some of the fundamental constitutional requirements. When we're talking about soliciting or panhandling, we're talking about speech. Now, we may also be talking about conduct, and we probably are talking about conduct, but fundamentally, to beg or to solicit, or to panhandle, is a form of speech. When you think about it, there are accepted practices that are long-term. At Christmas time, it's not uncommon for some charitable organizations to be out there ringing a bell and asking for people to give money to that organization. it's not uncommon for nonprofits to sell, to use the sidewalks to sell things like T-shirts and things in connection with a parade or something like that. The point here is that there are, we really don't have the ability under the First Amendment to say, well, some of these solicitations are good and some aren't, and decide which ones are good and which ones aren't, and then to try to regulate it. That would be a content-based regulation. And that's going to be trouble. The courts are going to, the term that the courts apply to that is strict scrutiny. And very rarely do you see a content-based restriction withstand the strict scrutiny of a court. So when you're talking about the First Amendment, just to throw out a bit more catchphrases in this, the first thing that you have to, the government has to identify if it's going to regulate free speech is a substantial governmental interest. And let me give you an example of a clear speech. Someone standing on a street corner handing out handbills. Or maybe they're soliciting signatures on an initiative petition. They're just standing on a street corner and they say, you know, can I explain this to you and can I ask you to sign this initiative? Or maybe they're handing out a pamphlet called Common Sense or something like that. What's the substantial governmental interest in regulating that? There's a bit of conduct involved. They're putting a petition in front of people they might be handling. But what's the negative governmental or public impact of that sort of thing? And it's pretty hard to identify one. Let's say with a handbill, you say, well, we're concerned that it would be littering, so we want to ban passing out handbills on a street corner because of a concern having to do with littering, and people just throw them on the ground. And that's a legitimate concern, but I'll have to tell you that I don't think the courts would consider that a substantial governmental interest, nor would they say that you can ban handbills because they wouldn't say a ban is, in the phrase, a narrowly tailored regulation, a time, place, and manner regulation. If you're concerned about littering, what you ought to do is make it illegal to litter and not to ban someone who's passing out handbills. And so just to maybe finish this up, fundamentally, the first thing you have to do when you're, as a government, regulating speech is what's our substantial governmental interest, and will our regulations be narrowly tailored time, place, and manner restrictions, and will they have nothing to do with the content of the speech? So let's talk about content. This ordinance has nothing to do with whether someone is soliciting for a nonprofit or not, or for what might be, considered a good cause as opposed to a good public cause, as opposed to private cause, someone just trying to hustle some money. This ordinance does not really inquire into that. This ordinance really tries to identify the negative conduct and to only regulate that negative conduct, and to do that as narrowly as possible and as reasonably as possible, time, place, and manner restrictions. So with that said, I'd like to turn to the definition in this ordinance of solicitation and essentially make it clear that passive, what I will call passive solicitation, is absolutely not regulated here. And let's say it's a person standing on a street corner with a sign that says, "I'm hungry, please help." They're holding the sign in one hand and they're holding their hand out in the other. This ordinance does not impact that person. This does not regulate someone who's merely standing there with a sign that says, "Please help, I'm hungry." What if they're holding a cup? It doesn't matter. What if they're sitting on a street bench? This ordinance does not impact them. Because we're going to get into some regulations about people sitting on street benches on State Street. But if you're just sitting there with a sign, you're not being regulated. And I'm going to go through this in some detail. Please feel free to interrupt me, because it is a bit confusing. You have to kind of go through it three different ways to understand the a very basic point, and that is, again, First Amendment case law. Have you left open ample opportunities, reasonable ample opportunities for people to panhandle? And one of the goals at the end of the day for this ordinance is to say, yes, we have allowed people to panhandle in the city in plenty of different ways, but in some ways we are going to regulate those. So again, if you're what I would call passive solicitation with a sign is not regulated at all anywhere in the city, because that's pretty much pure speech. And we would have a hard time regulating pure speech, probably impossible time regulating pure speech. This ordinance is about people who verbally solicit. And I will tell you, it is really only about people who verbally solicit at narrow locations. Let's take an example. This ordinance, as drafted, would not, unless I'm missing it, regulate someone standing in front of the main post office over here, because they wouldn't be within 25 feet of a sidewalk dining table. They wouldn't be within 25 feet of an ATM. They're not within 25 feet of a bus stop. And they're not within, they're not in proximity or soliciting from someone waiting in line for a movie or waiting in line for something else. That's what this ordinance regulates. It regulates people who verbally solicit at selected locations, at ATMs, from someone, well, within 25 feet of a sidewalk dining table, bus stop, queues, people waiting in line. It also has certain things that it regulates when certain types of conduct. And if I could direct your attention to, it's page 2 at the bottom, it's called abusive panhandling, where we define abusive panhandling. Again, panhandling is the verbal solicitation, and then we create this second concept called abusive panhandling. And it's so, if you're verbally soliciting someone and blocking or impeding the passage or free movement of that person, that's abusive panhandling. If you're verbally soliciting someone and you're following them by proceeding behind, ahead, or alongside him or her after the person has declined to make a donation, that's abusive panhandling. If you're threatening someone either by word or gesture with physical harm or an assault, that's abusive panhandling. If you're verbally, essentially abusing someone, abusing the person panhandled with words which are offensive and inherently likely to provoke an immediate violent reaction, that's abusive panhandling. If you touch someone, you not only verbally solicit someone, but you put your hand on their shoulder without that person's consent, that's abusive panhandling. And then the last one, and I'll get into this in a bit more detail. If you engage in verbal solicitation in any of the prohibited places or any of the circumstances specified in Section 030, and that's where, as I mentioned, bus stops within 25 feet of a, or well, there's more, in a vehicle from on a public street, alleyway, or city parking lot, within a parking lot, and this in downtown area, this could be a significant factor, within an outdoor dining area or of a restaurant or dining establishment, within 25 feet of an ATM, or in a queue of 5 or more persons waiting in line. That's really the heart of what we're getting at. So again, going back, if someone is standing on a street corner and they're not within so many feet of an ATM, they're not verbally addressing anyone at a sidewalk dining table, they're not within 25 feet, or they're at a bus stop, but they're verbally soliciting people as they come by. Hey, you have a nickel? I guess they don't say that. That's not illegal. That's not. It doesn't matter where it is. It can be on State Street. It can be on Anacapa. Their verbal solicitation is still legal under some circumstances. We also regulate verbal solicitation when people are sitting on a bench. And again, these are only certain streets and only certain blocks of those streets. State Street within from the 400 block to the 1200 block, Milpa Street from the 000 South block to the 200 block north, and Cabrillo Boulevard between Castillo and Milpas. And those are, if you're sitting on a bench and you're verbally soliciting someone, that's a violation. That's considered abusive panhandling. Excuse me. The last section makes abusive panhandling a misdemeanor. And that's, in a way, that's more of a policy statement than anything else, because actually any violation of the municipal code is a misdemeanor, potentially. But there is a code section in Title I that allows the city attorney's office to actually prosecute municipal code violations as infractions. And that's typically what we do. In this case, I think the intention is, if possible, is to, whenever we receive abusive solicitation, abusive panhandling citation, if we have the resources, we're going to prosecute those as misdemeanors. And until I think there is a consensus at the city that we've gotten past some of these problems, and we can maybe ease off on that and treat it as an infraction, possibly as an infraction for people who haven't been cited before or something like that. That's my presentation on the draft ordinance. Again, this is, I think it's mentioned in the council agenda report, this is very similar to the approach taken by the city of Santa Monica. That's the only city that I know of right now. Last I checked with the Santa Monica city attorney a few weeks ago, despite getting threatened about a lawsuit over this ordinance, this type of ordinance, they were not sued. They have not been sued yet. I think that's a pretty good indication that a constitutional lawyer looking at this says that it's saying, well, you know, I think the city may have weaved their way through the constitutional minefield here and ended up at a place that is probably legal and defensible. So with that, I'll answer any questions or turn it over to Sue.
First, if there's any more to the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair Williams, council members. I just wanted to put it into context a little bit with the 12 strategies that the subcommittee came up with. So I'll just quickly go through that. As you know, on June 17th, 2008, Council formed the subcommittee to deal with issues related to homelessness. Council members Falcone, Francisco, and Schneider served on that subcommittee. There were 9 meetings held from July 2008 to January 2009, and on February 24th, Council approved 12 strategies to deal with the issues. The 12 strategies fell into categories of enforcement, intervention, and prevention. The strategy intended to be implemented along with this strategy is intended to be implemented along with the panhandling education and alternate giving campaign. In fact, I believe the recommendation number 1 says enforcement of this ordinance must be done in coordination with the panhandling education campaign and a Santa Barbara Cares compassionate giving campaign. These 2 recommendations came out of the subcommittee meeting that was held on September 11th, 2008, after public input and a lot of discussion. For that meeting, we did a little bit of research on other jurisdictions and what kind of ordinances they have and what kind of panhandling programs they have. And that research showed us 3 different things. First was all of the jurisdictions acknowledged that panhandling in itself is legal. Second, most of the cities attempted to enforce aggressive panhandling laws, but the police felt that they were constrained in actually implementing those ordinances. And third, there was an acknowledgement on all the jurisdictions that not all panhandlers are homeless. So it's not just homeless people that this ordinance is addressing. And the intent of this strategy, and it was both together, the panhandling education, compassionate giving, and this ordinance, is not to victimize homeless persons, but to educate the community and to provide an alternate for panhandling that would help those people that need help. So that's all I have to add. Thanks.
Questions, Mr. House?
Mr. Wiley, I know we have some public comment, but I just want to go through the actual ordinance itself, and then later I can make comments about the general deal here. Let's look real quickly at 9.50.010 purpose. And just in the first sentence, about 5 lines down, 4 or 5 lines, it says, in order to protect the safety and the right of the general public to be free from exposure to these forms of, and it says inappropriate public conduct and physical contact. And just before we're finished today, just look to see if we need the word inappropriate, if inappropriate is necessary there. It just is a judgment that we would have to defend. On page 2, where it defines panhandling, it seems like we're trying to make a clear distinction between panhandling, which was just mentioned as it is legal to panhandle. It's not illegal, but abusive panhandling, we're distinguishing it. And the third line, then, a person will not be deemed to be in the act of abusive panhandling when he or she passively displays a sign, beginning perhaps to make the distinction there. And I'd like to hear your comment after we're done on that. It seems like we need to really begin to distinguish between panhandling and abusive panhandling, even in this part of the definition. I had a question on page 3 about the cues concept and the way that you were articulating it. And I think 5 is probably a number we picked out of the air unless there's some legal precedent that connects us with 5. And I just wondered if we need to define it as cue or just the person's waiting. And then a couple of questions here about signage. We're going to probably need to address that before we're all done. I'm sure somebody's going to come up and say, well, nobody informed so-and-so that they couldn't panhandle at a bus stop or at a bench or something. And then ATMs maybe. And this last little piece here, just as a question, again, too, just for our consideration for later, if not right now, it appears that the intention of bringing this forward is to have it be implemented in conjunction with 2 other key things, an education program of some sort, and the, is it called the CARES, Santa Barbara CARES or something program? So where in, it wouldn't show up, I guess, in the ordinance, but somehow in the way that this gets presented to the City Council, that would have to be addressed as to how this gets proposed, because I think it could be counterproductive or certainly go against the intention of the 12 points if this were to just be out there, hanging out there by itself. So those are the things that were on my mind just after your presentation and just to get us started. I don't know if you need to respond to any of that right now, but
let me just mention, Councilmember House, on that first point. There is actually 2 concepts running through this ordinance. One is panhandling, and the other is abusive panhandling. So to qualify that, I think it was the second sentence of the definition with the word abusive would not be appropriate, because we do have circumstances where it's not all abusive panhandling. It's not all going to be charged as a misdemeanor. So
Isn't passively displaying a sign or provide another indication that he or she is seeking donations, in this case without addressing his or her solicitation to a specific person, isn't that actually what panhandling is? It's just not abusive panhandling. And that's the reason I brought that up. Maybe you want to look at that as we...
Well, I guess the problem is when people say panhandling is not illegal.
Right.
That's not true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what you've done in the ordinance is you've defined essentially passive panhandling not as panhandling.
Right.
For the purposes of the ordinance.
I'm going to request that we look at how we have, when you define it, it's one of those little circular things, you know, it gets going there when we're using the same word in the definition and we're trying to distinguish it from something, and it's hard for me to distinguish it here.
Well, let me give you an example. It's not abusive panhandling to sit on a bench and to solicit, but it is if the bench is located in one of the blocks of State Street. That's where we're making the distinction. Now, I suppose we could That's why I say this does get complex. There are the concept of panhandling on a bench on State Street in one of the blocks that's illegal panhandling. It's not abusive panhandling, and we wouldn't necessarily prosecute it as a misdemeanor.
I would suggest then, and again, as it goes a little, I think I want to resolve this as early as possible. I think that panhandling, defined here, any request made in person seeking an immediate donation of money or other item of value, period. That, to me, defines panhandling. Now, down here below, you've clarified what abusive panhandling is, and perhaps the qualifying statement, the next sentence, a person will not be deemed to be in the act of abusive panhandling when he or she is passively displays a sign or whatever. That should be a qualifier under C, as opposed to mixed up with A. I think I really want a clarity of the definition that panhandling is making a request in person seeking an immediate donation of money. It may or may not be illegal. And then when we talk about abusive panhandling, we say what it is, and then with this one sentence, we indicate an example of when it's not, what it's not. But when we have it in that A, I think it's a concern. So I don't want to perseverate.
Well, we can certainly move that down to C.
It would really help
what I'm
clarify
referring
C.
to is if you look at 030, use of public benches for panhandling.
Yes, sir.
That's where just sitting there soliciting is made illegal. And that's not abusive that's not defined as abusive panhandling. That's just defined as using one of the benches in a block that you're not supposed to be using for panhandling.
To me, that's crystal clear. And same thing with the abusive panhandling definition C.
Okay.
The only thing I have a concern about is that panhandling, if we just simply define it and then move that clarifying sentence down into under C or wherever else you would like to have it.
We can definitely move that down to, I think, maybe the end of C.
There you go.
Yeah.
Like that. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Wiley, I think I didn't really understand Mr. House's point originally, but I think I do now. And so in that very first sentence there in the section A, panhandling, the definition, any request made in person, so you mean any verbal request? Yes. Okay. So that really is the distinction.
Right.
Because I guess you could think, holding out a sign that says, help me, please, I need money, is a request in a way, right?
Right. Why don't we
Clarify that by saying verbal?
verbal?
Are you sure? Are you
verbal
sure about that?
request?
Panhandling as a general class can happen a whole bunch of ways. A person puts their hand out and they just hold a cup in front of you.
Yeah, but
that's panhandling.
That's not what we're regulating.
No, that's right. That we're regulating abusive panhandling, not panhandling in general. Anyway, those are. I get your point, Mr. Francisco, but I'm thinking that we're trying to distinguish between panhandling as a general class, which can happen in a lot of ways, and in a certain kind of panhandling that we're regulating very narrowly. We're regulating verbal panhandling, and here's the list of things, and we're regulating panhandling in certain specific places, and we're getting very narrow about it. But panhandling is a general thing. A mute person could come and panhandle. So I think that we want to make sure that the A, panhandling, is just a definition, and then C and 030 over here do the specific job of telling everybody what we're regulating.
I'd prefer to make it clear that we're not regulating. If someone's mute, they cannot be guilty of what we're calling illegal panhandling.
Right. But see, A is panhandling is just a definition of the term, and it's being distinguished from abusive panhandling. And panhandling is it may not even be a bad thing. It's not necessarily illegal. It may be illegal. It may not. Panhandling, just as a definition, is just simply a request made in person seeking an immediate donation of money or other item of value. I might be panhandling to get some change to get on the bus and not violating any law. Of course, if I was right next to a bus stop, I might have to watch out. But my point is that panhandling just by itself is not by its nature illegal. But if it's in a certain place or done in a certain way, it's abusive, and that's what we're trying to distinguish here.
So, Mr. Wiley, I don't want to go too deep into this wormhole, but were you trying to make a distinction between what you're calling panhandling and soliciting donations? Was that the idea?
No, not because that would sort of get into the content. I'll tell you, I had this same problem. I was going over, this is pretty much the exact way that Santa Monica worded it, and I know how that office operates, and that city operates in city council. I think they went over this with some thought, so I was sort of disinclined to tinker with their language, but I had the same questions. Why doesn't it say verbal, and why is it then define it in the first sentence and then say, well, but it's not this in the second sentence? And I'm guessing that, for example, let's take the first instance of abusive panhandling, blocking or impeding the passage or free movement. Would it be a violation if you stood in front of somebody and you clearly blocked their passage and you didn't say anything to them? Because it said, if we added the word verbal, you may be, hey, you're pointing to your cup and you keep blocking them and you're kind of hulking over them, but you don't say anything. Are we trying to regulate that, make that? I think we are. But then if we've added the word verbal, I didn't say anything, so it wasn't a verbal request. We said, well, it was clearly a request because you kept pointing it. I can only guess that they were trying to deal with some of these things, and that's why they didn't put the word verbal there. But I really don't know the answer.
Well, Mr. Chair, I know we need to hear from the public, but I think that to me it's pretty important that if we're going to define panhandling, we don't put any value on it. We just define what panhandling is, which is a certain kind of soliciting or a donation of money. It's just that's what it is, and it's done in person, and it's asking for money or an item of value. And so that has no connotation. Then we clearly distinguish abusive panhandling, which we are working and attempting to regulate. And we have a couple different ways. It's the location and it's the kind of behavior. And not getting into content and also narrowly defining it. And then maybe helpful, as Mr. Wiley has done many times, he'll include an example of what the thing is not to help distinguish it, which I think is what that second sentence in A does. It just belongs somewhere else.
I see what you're trying to do now, but the only problem that would then create, Mr. House, is that this ordinance categorizes abusive panhandling or abusive solicitation as a misdemeanor, but it does not do that to illegal panhandling. So if you categorize all illegal panhandling as abusive panhandling, then we are making all of those things a misdemeanor. We're using the term as defined here, abusive panhandling, which probably should show up in 950.040, and as opposed to abusive solicitation, we probably should use the defined term abusive panhandling as defined. But in any case, we're only specifically addressing what's being defined as abusive panhandling in this ordinance, and it's defined very crystal clear here with these points. And we are distinguishing it from panhandling as a general category because I know, but then what if it, as written, panhandling at a bus stop is still an infraction as this ordinance is written, and if I'm understanding you correctly, as you're asking to rewrite it, panhandling at a bus stop would then become a misdemeanor?
No, I didn't address that at all. What I'm just trying to do is be consistent with the terminology wherever we use it. And then if we're defining abusive panhandling, and that has a particular set of it's defined very clearly, and it is distinct from panhandling as a general classification. That's all. And then maybe Mr. Wiley can help us with how we deal with whether it's a misdemeanor or whatever else it is.
I'm just bringing up the fact that if we define all illegal panhandling as abusive panhandling, then we have to figure out what to do with the enforcement. We have to bifurcate the terminology somehow, otherwise we are going to be enforcing all of them as misdemeanors. So, I mean, that's just something to chew on.
Mr. Wiley's help when we get to that point.
My concerns are in 030B, which is at the locations. Mr. Wiley, you said that within 25 feet of any of these locations, but that's not what
I misspoke there. It's only 25 feet of an ATM.
So it's at a bus stop or at one of these locations or within 25 feet of a ATM, but the within 25 feet is only applicable to the ATM.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think we'll take public comment at this point, and we'll start with Fred Kuhlman. And each speaker will have
Well,
minutes.
I've relied on panhandling since I came to Santa Barbara. I was taught by one of the best panhandlers, and it was aggressive panhandling. It was asking everybody as we walked up from Tad's Liquor to the theater up there and the Arlington, and we'd have enough money. But I also flew a sign, and from what I understood is with me flying the sign, long as I don't approach those people and they read my sign and they laugh at it and then comment on it, then I could have a conversation with them. And so I'd have the conversation, and I used to fly a sign every day in front of Thrifty's, and I'd make a new sign every day, and people would come up and say, your printing's getting better, and they'd give me $1, you know. But I was short on my medication the 24th because I'm on Social Security, and I get $8.88 a month, and I started over by Ralph's, and I came up and I progressive panhandle. I asked people, I said, excuse me, I'm $1.10 short of my medication. And people were glad to give it to me. I felt kind of bad by the time I got to Arlington because I had $36. So progressive panhandling does work. You know, if you're polite, you make the person laugh, you know, or, you know, feel sorry, but I wasn't telling a lie. I needed my medication. And, but there's so many other problems that have to be addressed. Right now, the homeless are saying, we got to run from the cops and we got to run from the people that are kicking each other to death. You know, which way to go? They're running, you know, wild, you know, but you guys are working very delicate. I mean, I can't say the word. You're working hard to make it, because everything else, all the funding from 91 to 2009 was spent on programmers. People coming from one program to another program, from another program. So I got some news from here, and they say that we're switching that over to chronic homelessness, and that's where the president wants us to go to, and Butch started it. I think you guys are doing a great job. I hear we have 2 more projects coming up in the works, and you know, it takes a little bit. You know, after somebody 15 years underneath the Bush, they don't know how to handle themselves. You know, they're used to getting drunk and falling down and making noise, but I think you're doing a good job, you know, with what you're doing, but I think everything should be reviewed after a year, because you turned all these infractions into misdemeanors, which is, in the long run, costs us, the city, money for the court costs and everything, and it's going to be money you're never going to collect. They're going to go out to the jail, so, you know, and the state's not kicking you the money down.
Can we wrap up?
Okay.
Okay. Very good suggestion about the year in review, though, Mr. Coleman, and remind me, I should have you doing my fundraising for my political campaigns. Mr. Hanson, followed by Bonnie Donovan.
Ho, ho, ho. We haven't talked about the stinky panhandlers. I think we all heard about the stinky homeless. Remember? West Side. People talked about the stinky ones.
I don't think you're stinky at all, Bob.
I'm not talking about me. I took a bath, but I'm just saying there's some people that are without housing. Maybe there's some people in housing that stink. But I think when I read that, I was wanting to talk to Nick about it and say, what was really happening at that meeting? I mean, to me, that's hate, and we don't need hate. And I think anyone that was at that meeting should have sat there and said, hey, stop. You don't call people stink and, have laws and run them out of town. Hey, maybe we could come up with some solutions and get them some showers or shower cards or something. But anyway, that whole mindset is kind of still happening. The 12 strategies, the homeless weren't in on that. It was the city and business and the police. This whole thing is just a big railroad thing. So now we're working on one strategy. There's still 11 more to go. Sounds like Steve was saying that they don't want people sitting on a bench on State Street with a sign. Is that what I'm hearing?
No.
No? Because that sounded like you said that, on State Street. Just like they have, you can't sit on the sidewalk on State Street, But anyway, so we're not talking about that. So you can sit on the public bench and have a sign. Another thing is, someone's brought it before that people are out there making $60,000 or something like that, all these panhandlers. I think most of these panhandlers, they're lucky if they get 10, they go get some cigarettes, whatever they might need. Street people, need to be treated in a little more humane way, because what we're trying to do is say, hey, you got to get off the street, you got to get into recovery. That's a personal thing, and we should look at it personally too and say, hey, can we help you? Instead of like, oh yeah, we got to get in recovery, homeless can't drink beers, and you can't do this, can't do that. I know Bob Casey, he was out there working with restorative policing, and the county doesn't have enough beds. So we're taking people from this community that have mental problems, taking them down to Orange County, out to San Fernando Valley. We need to encourage more beds and to help people. Panhandling with a sign isn't that big a deal, but the aggressive ones that are in your face, that does need to be addressed. And anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Bonnie Donovan, followed by Paul Bullock.
I'm one of those people that started the West Beach group, which now, because it's East Beach and West Beach, is now going to be called Santa Barbara Oceanfront. And I never use the word stinky, but I still have the right to have my property protected. And if you can go from Ralph's to the Arlington and get $36, when are you going to start taxing that? It'll help us give them more beds. We just caught, with the help of the police, an aggressive panhandler that's been going door to door to the hotels. So in this somewhere, panhandling should not be allowed around any hotel, because the guy was going door to door. If you didn't give him his $50 for a bus ticket, Mr. House, then he got aggressive. And then when they did give him $50, he came back and said, you only gave me $10. Also, restaurants in our area, if you don't give them the money, they spit in your food. And what about car washes? If we can get the car washes and liquor stores on the thing where they can't panhandle around that, it would help a lot. And they're very, very aggressive in our area. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Where's the little one today?
I know she'd like to be here, but
Paul,
she'll need a new crib for her brother.
Paul Bullock,
Thank you,
followed
Mr.
by
Williams
Daniel Knapp.
And council members, Mr. Wiley. I'm Paul Bullock. I manage the Eagle Inn downtown in West Beach, and I'm also part of the West Beach group. I support the 12-point program that the city's come up with. I think some of the items could be a little bit more expanded. Instead of just being on a few blocks of State Street, for example, make it over in West Beach or down by the harbor. Between State and the harbor would be a good expansion. Question about enforcing the rules as 25 feet from an ATM. Are we going to have to put a line around? Because it's kind of a subjective distance, and how will, they'll say, oh, I wasn't within that distance, and other people say, yes, you were. So I support it, and thank you.
Daniel Knapp, followed by Michael Jordan.
All right, I'll give you an example. Me and my friends here, we're trying to get a bus ticket to China so we can go there and get a real job. Would you find that offensive if I said that to you as you were walking down State Street? My point is that there's a case in Berkeley that was settled a long time ago, and that is if you engage somebody in conversation, that's free speech, and really you're not soliciting, you're engaging somebody, you're basically entertaining. It's a broad use of the word. So really what's going on here is a protracted war on the poor. It's nothing new. You already have laws on your books for accosting people. I mean, you know, if somebody's being a jerk, that can be dealt with. And I think what's happening here is you're pinpointing people that are either mentally ill or they're intoxicated because they don't have anything better to do, which is what I used to do. And you don't have any detox facility. The people with mental health, the other day I saw a person in Starbucks, panhandling people in Starbucks. I asked police officers, is there something that restorative police officers and mental health can do, get on the same page? He said, no, it's like leading a horse to water. So what's happening is that I also play music on State Street, and I've been doing this since 1982, long before Mason v. Mason and all that. And don't blame it on the recent downturn in economy. Basically what I see is people looking down their noses at musicians, and the attitude is pretty much like, well, these guys have a creative thing going on. They're actually panhandling with instruments. And I think somebody in the works, like Chamber of Commerce or the downtown organization, or maybe Mr. Francisco over there, somebody's putting a word out that, you know, these so-called entertainers on State Street are really panhandlers. I don't know. I don't have any proof. But the attitude is either these people don't know what entertainment is, or, you know, I'm tooting my own horn here, but I know the musicians are all suffering, and you can't even get a gig in a club anymore because ordinances and such. You people are so tight you squeak when you walk. You cut your nose off to spite your face. Just look at your beachfront. Been arguing about that forever. You can't even have a good time in this town anymore. You get people drunk and then tell them not to dance. I mean, what the hell's going on? I think there's, you know, you can enforce laws of people being disruptive or obnoxious or whatever. You don't have to pick on the poor. Thank you.
Mr. Jordan, followed by Peter.
Well, apparently I'm going to resemble those remarks in a moment. But good afternoon, committee members.
You can have a good time when you.
Oh, I can either way, and I've grown to love the DOS. We should all dance too. So, I think you all know I've been part of participating in the subcommittee and then part of the subsequent task force that's still working, and it is a complex problem. I'm gratified that people like Paul Bullock, who weren't there almost a year ago to participate in the subcommittee, have been dragged on to participating with the task force going further. Hope to get that young lady next to him also involved as it goes forward. I share some of the confusion that I think Mr. House has, and a couple. I know this isn't for question and answer, but I'll just throw them up there and then leave. But I think I have the definition of panhandling and what is not panhandling. So if I'm sitting quietly with a sign, I'm not panhandling. But then when you go to point 030 and you start talking about abusive panhandling, the second line goes back to the word panhandling, which is, again, sitting passively with a sign. And I'm confused, too. I think this question's been answered several times differently already. I read that one time, and I think I can sit on a bench with a sign passively at a bus stop and panhandle. And then I read it a different time, and I think maybe that's not now because maybe you're calling that abusive panhandling. I think the intent of what we went through when we were meeting with the task force was to identify particular areas in town that had a nexus to residents' enjoyment and to economic stability and begin to protect those areas from that type of behavior. I don't know if that accomplishes that or not. And here's where I'll fall into the category of Mr. Knapp. I see no reference in here at all to other nonverbal behavior, which includes amplified music downtown, for instance, on the porch of Pescucci's, where if you go to listen to Sinatra, you're forced to listen to amplified acoustic guitar work on the patio. Articles for sale that are being spread out on benches or parkways downtown. And the other example would be the fishing pole that seemingly keeps going up and down in front of my path while I'm trying to walk up and down the sidewalk. So those might be some other areas of concern. And I think on a positive note, the task force is still meeting. I know there's a lot of community involved with that. I'm still committed to making sure that each of the contrasting segments of the community keep working on this project. But this is part of the buy-in for the community and the business people to have something there to sink teeth into and to participate in the rest of the process. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, and for your participation in the task force. We really appreciate that. Peter Marin will be our last speaker.
I have a couple of points I hope you'll hear me through.
You have 3 minutes, Peter.
According to social workers, we had 4 attacks in downtown State Street in this last week on homeless people. The homeless people have not reported this to the police, so the police are not aware of it. They reported it to social workers. Anyone can talk to Ken Williams. The 4 people attacked ascribed the attacks to gang members. That may or may not be so. We have a guy in the hospital because he was burned over 60% of his body under suspicious circumstances just when he was sleeping outside. We have a guy dead in a wheelchair. Beside the wheelchair, the coroner has reported there were no suspicious elements, but it's still a problem for people on the street. We now have a program in order to defend merchants' interest, which is reasonable enough. But in that same period of time, the homeless have become increasingly endangered. And it is in part, I believe, because of rhetoric that finds its way into the newspapers, which is not in your control, but nonetheless exists. So we go from those meetings on the West Side to journalistic reports. And in those reports, as we know across the country, when the homeless are scapegoated or criticized, their danger goes up because they seem to become fair game for certain elements in the community, though that's not what the merchants want, that's not what the council wants, it's not even what the police want, but it happens. It's an unintended consequence of certain kinds of reports and certain kinds of criticisms in which the worst of the homeless and the worst of the behavior is somehow blamed on the group at large, and it seems to make them fair game for certain people. The second part of that is as the police increase their perusal of the homeless and the rounding up of the homeless, and I might add the illegal confiscation of their belongings, they have to hide from public view. As they hide from public view, they become more solitary and they become more hidden from view, and they become far more endangered than they would otherwise be. The problem here is not that they should be in a park, or the problem is nobody knows where they should be or can be, even though we know that there are far more people on the streets than can ever be given beds in any of the shelters. We know that for a fact, yet we hound them and we harass them to the point where they have to be in perpetual hiding. They lose all trust of the police. As you know, the police have appointed as liaison to the homeless, in the eyes of the homeless, the worst officer on the force. There's no trust of the police. There's no going to the police when people are endangered. And my point to you here is, if you're into task forces and into committees, at this point in time, there certainly should be a group that looks at conditions on the street in relation to the homeless, that confers not just with the police, but with social workers who have the facts from being on the ground. And at some point in time, you have to realize the job of the police is not just to harass the homeless, but to protect them. That's gotten lost in this whole process. And the people who suffer at the far end of this process are people in the street. You don't mean it, but it happens. So,
very good point, but just wrap up.
I will wrap up now. One thing I want to say about panhandling, we had a case, it was in a police complaint. Several people dealt with Officer Hove. Their dog was taken away. They had to get the dog back. They panhandled to get the dog back. My point to you about that is, if you're going to discourage panhandling, there certainly should be a fund for homeless people in emergencies so they don't have to panhandle to get money for their medication or to get money to get their dog back. You would reduce a lot of panhandling if you had access to small amounts of money that would enable people to get by without begging. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have 7 minutes of comments from the council and proceed onward. Mr. House.
maybe at some point, it's not going to be today, but at some point we would be able to consider some kind of enhanced penalties or consequences for violence against homeless people. And it's something that perhaps the city can do without having it be a federal or state thing, because we've seen enough death and enough attacks that have been just barbarous on people who are the most vulnerable in our community. This isn't really addressing homelessness here. We're talking about panhandling, and a lot of people who panhandle aren't homeless. They just panhandle. So I think we need to make sure that we're clear that that's what we're addressing, and we're specifically addressing a very narrow category within the world of panhandling. Panhandling, the way we're defining it here, is neither, I mean, it's both, I guess, legal and illegal once we get the abusive panhandling defined. So I think that we need to really make sure that our definitions are clear. There's just something called panhandling. We've got a simple sentence definition for that. And then there's abusive panhandling, and then there are locations where panhandling happens that we are addressing. And also we're addressing the use of public benches where they can be dominated for long, long periods of time. And people, perhaps seniors or others who need to use them to rest, don't have that opportunity. And that was described in our staff report. So just a quick comment to a couple things that we just heard. Yes, more beds. That's part of the 12 points. I mean, that's the idea. Then also for Mr. Marin, who just left, unfortunately, the idea of establishing a fund and being able to create some sort of a way to direct people's generosity in a way that doesn't enable inappropriate behavior, especially dual diagnosis, substance abuse, and that kind of thing. So I think it's key that we get this put in place once it goes past City Council, that it is seen as part of a complex, or part of at least 3 things, as it was recommended. The question, I have a question from Mr. Wiley on 030 here. This is on page 3, item 3. Within a city parking lot, I guess that means that should just be single, and within a city parking lot or parking structure, we are addressing municipal lots only, not just parking lots in general.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember House, I probably need to be clear. We can only do what we can do and what we have. There are a lot of laws. When people say, well, we need to make it illegal to panhandle in a hotel, it's already illegal to panhandle in a hotel. That's trespassing. Mm-hmm. And the same is true of a private parking lot. There's a big element here, and I guess a lot of people don't fully understand this, that a private property owner needs to see that the law, or help us enforce the law with respect to their private property. So if it's a hotel or a private parking lot and someone is standing in there or walking in there and soliciting people, they should call the police and say, this person is trespassing and I want them arrested or cited for trespassing. And we can't start going there because it's pretty much never ending. As I say, the laws are already on the books, and it's, the 602J of the Penal Code has about 10 subsections that describe different ways you can trespass. So that's why this is about city property and public sidewalks, public parking lots, and streets, and that's really what we need to concentrate on here, I think.
Okay, thank you. That's real helpful, actually. Then if we go to 040 at the end, the penalty for abusive solicitation, we didn't define abusive solicitation anywhere, I mean the term. And I'd just like to question, and going back to the definitions where we talk about abusive panhandling.
I'm sorry, that's my mistake. I thought I did a search for solicitation and substituted panhandling.
Which way do we want to go, though? Do we want to talk about, like in C, should we be defining abusive solicitation and distinguish that from panhandling as a general class? No, you want to use the word abusive panhandling in both places.
Right. I'm sorry. I was trying to change the term to abusive panhandling in all cases, and I just
okay. And then
my suggestion on differentiating those would be to have a section that defines active panhandling and one that defines passive panhandling, because passive panhandling is essentially legal under all these circumstances. Would that address your
there's
desire?
no, because passive okay, so we have to.
Because active panhandling is illegal in at certain locations, but not illegal at others. Passive is always legal, and abusive is always illegal.
Careful, Grant, you're running out of time.
I already gave him extra time.
I don't know. We didn't define active and we didn't define passive as such. You used passive here to just distinguish between the way that we define abusive. So, Mr. Wiley, you can help us with that. I think it's important that we be clear and that we don't get these terms mixed up. In fact, somebody could be sitting on a bench on State Street in a 400 to 1200 block, or on Milpa Street within a certain area, or on Cabrillo within a certain area. They could be sitting on a bench and taking up the bench and doing what's called passive panhandling, and that would be a violation here.
That's not correct.
Okay, then please talk to me about 035, because that's the way it reads to me.
This is really the crux of it, unless I'm misunderstanding. 035 is the single instance when as currently written, the conduct of panhandling is illegal. And panhandling is a verbal solicitation or some form of solicitation directed at a person. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it's illegal when you're doing it from one of these benches on one of these blocks.
And then panhandling
But that's not abusive panhandling, and because it's not abusive, it's not going to be prosecuted as a misdemeanor.
So if somebody makes the request with a sign on a bench.
Again, going back, using a sign only is not regulated at all. That's like standing on a street corner getting signatures on an initiative petition.
Then we need to be very careful here, Mr. Wiley, because the word panhandling is being used there, and it's defined in the first sentence of A. So I think there's some clarity that needs to be worked on. Maybe after today's meeting you can work that out, because panhandling can be with a sign, it can be verbal, it can be anything. It can be aggressive or it can be very passive, it can be pleasant, it can be unpleasant. But here you're using panhandling in its general terms, so maybe you need to be...
Okay, well, we can think about defining passive panhandling.
It must be some way to deal with that, because that's that right here we have a little confusion. I don't want us to have that kind of confusion later. Anyway, those are my basic comments. I guess the last thing I want to say is, when somebody's being abusive or aggressive or in your face or whatever that is to a passerby, that same kind of abuse or aggressiveness is inappropriate with homeless people. It's inappropriate with anybody, and we don't want that kind of behavior in our city. And that's what we're addressing. We're actually creating penalties around that kind of behavior when it's associated with panhandling. And I think the safety of everyone is enhanced when we do that. So I think the narrow definitions we have here get us there.
Thank you, Mr. House. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with your point that aggressive panhandlers give homeless people in general a bad name, and especially when the most aggressive and most obnoxious and most inappropriate panhandlers that I encounter aren't even homeless. So I think that's a very, very important point to be putting in all of this, and we're not talking about. I've been very clear that in the direction that the city moves, I in no way wish to empower the criminalization of poverty, and this is not the criminalization of poverty. This is enforcing rules against essentially what is mostly very obnoxious young people who are not actually homeless, who are being really mean to people on the street. So, I don't have a problem with that. I do think that if I'm understanding this correctly, and is that you seem to be confusing the definition of panhandling that is in the ordinance with the definition that's common sense. And you keep on coming back to what common sense is.
No, I'm coming to specifically that panhandling, as defined by the group that put together the 12 points and the chronic homelessness task force, if you will. Panhandling is not by its nature illegal. There are certain kinds of panhandling that we're carefully defining that will be regulated. We already have one kind that's regulated, the aggressive kind that has been on the books for some time. But there's panhandling that is panhandling as a general characteristic is just, or behavior is requesting someone to donate money, give money, or an item of value, and that's called panhandling. But that's not. Then we are defining what we are regulating: abusive panhandling and panhandling in certain. In
I know,
certain
but
locations.
as soon as in this definition it says that, holding up a sign and not saying anything isn't panhandling, then it's not panhandling for the rest of the
That's why I
ordinance.
requested that sentence confuses it.
Right. And so
that sentence messes it up. It doesn't belong there.
That is why I am seeking to address your point, which is, I think, a mistake that people will commonly make, is that the ordinance basically changes the definition of what common sense says panhandling is to what the city's definition is of panhandling is, and maybe we need to be doing something that's a little bit more common sense by differentiating active panhandling from passive panhandling clearly in the ordinance. And I'm suggesting that because I don't want to just say to Mr. Wiley, go fix this between now and the council meeting. We should be providing direction of how to fix it. And so I hope that would address your point. If we define what active panhandling is and define what passive panhandling is and then define what abusive panhandling is, we are saying there's three different things. There is passive panhandling, which is always legal. There is abusive panhandling, which is always illegal. And then there is active panhandling, which is prohibited in certain locations and allowed in others. Would that
almost? There's some abuse. There's some passive panhandling that happens in inappropriate places that would be illegal. An example would be
not in this ordinance.
No. But I mean, in our city, there's some places where you can't passively panhandle. An example would be on a freeway off ramp behind the sign. I mean, there are places where it's illegal to be doing stuff like that. So, but I'm not against your idea of active and passive and abusive. I think that's okay. It's just that we're focusing in on abusive panhandling in these two instances, and then in, I suppose you call it active but not abusive panhandling in the case of the benches. Is that accurate, Mr. Wiley? Did I get that right?
That's correct.
Okay, then maybe those definitions will be helpful. But we should use those terms in the ordinance in their proper places so it's clear what we're talking about.
Great. Mr. Francisco? The only other point I made is that if we're worried about the subjectivity of 25 feet, maybe we should make that 35 feet to make it very clear that there is, if in proximity, it is legal.
You know, any foot radius is going to be. I think we're not worried about it. We're going to enforce on the extremes. In other words, we're not going to enforce if he's at 25. The officer won't even do it. The officer will write on the citation, the person was within arm's reach of someone standing at an ATM, and it will be clearly illegal. It's a practical matter how it typically works. So, but we do need to communicate to people what their conduct needs to be. So it is, I think, a good idea to have a foot on it. I'm not sure, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure it helps to make it 35 feet just to make it 35, to make it more enforceable.
I can only speak from experience because I do voter registration. I can definitely ask somebody 25 feet away to register to vote. So I don't know. I'm only speaking from my own experience. Of course, it's more difficult to explain to somebody or ask somebody to register to vote than it is to ask somebody for $1. So I don't know. That's where I think that having a little bit more distance might be helpful.
So 35 feet.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion, but my colleagues can comment on that. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of general comments about what it is we're doing here. The subcommittee on homelessness and community issues met for many months, over many meetings with lots and lots of people in this community, including, obviously, not just the police, but lots of social welfare organizations, nonprofits, and the meetings were well intended by the target audience as well. What we're doing here is something that is very small, very narrow, and very precise. This is not going to solve the problem of mentally ill people living on the streets, unfortunately. There's a lot of problems this isn't going to solve. As Mr. Williams said, this is directed at a very, very narrow set of bad behaviors that I think probably everyone in this room would agree are bad. As far as the ordinance itself is concerned, I believe that there is some confusion about the definitions here, and that needs to be resolved before we forward it to the full council. I would like to see it come back. I think, Mr. Wiley, you understand the sources of confusion. Personally, I would like to see it come back to us to verify that it is what the Ordinance Committee intends before forwarding it to City Council.
No, I was planning on that, yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that. And if anybody wants to make a motion to that effect, my one other point, though, is, Mr. House, you made the suggestion that we should not be passing this at City Council until there is the Santa Barbara Cares program unveiled at the same time. Was that your
I
point
suggested
earlier?
that if it's passed with the provision that it goes into effect in conjunction with the two items that were recommended. One was, what were the two things? Now I'm going to find them here. But that it was conjunction with a program of education on panhandling and the CARES program, the Santa Barbara CARES program. And that was what was recommended.
I agree with that. I think that it's really important for the political efficacy and for people to see that we're making progress on the multiple fronts of the program at once, and not just dealing with one aspect at a given time. So
Mr. Chairman.
That. Mr. Francisco.
That really, I believe, is a matter for the full council, and that our charge here is to make sure that the ordinance reflects what the council wanted it to. It's up to the council to decide when it takes effect.
That's fine. I think that's a good point. So did you want to make a motion, Mr. Francisco?
Yes, I move that we ask Mr. Wiley to clarify the definitions in this ordinance and to come back to us one more time for us to verify.
I second that, and if I may, Mr. Chair, there were two other items that I needed to mention that were I'd mentioned earlier, but I just want to make sure we've addressed it. One of them has to do with signage or notification, and maybe you have some comments to that, but I think that somehow needs to be addressed.
Well, all I can tell you is that normally you would not do that with criminal statutes, a penal statute such as this, involving what people are supposed to do. They're required to know the law. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, is an old saying. And other than the vehicle code and parking regulations, there is no posting requirement. When you think about it, where would we end? Where would we stop? We don't have signs saying you can't drink alcohol in public. Just to deal with some city regulations. We don't regulate personal conduct much as a city. That's all in the state penal code. But there aren't signs all over the place telling you what the state penal code requires you to do. And this is the same sort of thing. I don't know.
To me, I completely buy your logic. I'm just remembering our experience and not the too distant past about another thing that seemed very logical, and then the signage became the biggest issue in the whole world. So that's all. That's the reason I bring it up.
I suppose in this instance, if with the benches and the specific blocks,
little plaque or something.
Yeah, I know we're getting to that point where we start to worry about over signage. And
I know, and I'm thinking, but for instance, an ATM at a bank, they may very well want on their very own to post a little sign that cites this ordinance, and they just put it up nearby, and at least they've fulfilled their due diligence thing.
That's a good idea.
So, but I guess that goes a lot towards that education component that we just talked about a minute ago that the council will discuss. The other thing, the other item was the suggestion that, I forgot his last name, I'm sorry, Fred, who's Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry, suggested about a review after a year. Again, I'm sure City Council will want to have something like that to have a chance to take a look back and see how it's going. That's a typical thing that we do.
Well, we actually are planning on that as part of the assessment protocol for the subcommittee's 12 recommendations. So,
All right, very good. I think we've covered it pretty well.
Was that a second?
That was a second. Clarification was that, do we want 25 or 35 feet?
Personally, I think the 25 feet is fine, but I
do
can
too.
be swayed.
Okay. I'm mostly worried about somebody trying to get me to sign a petition, though. No, it's okay. I'm teasing.
If it's the will of the majority to do 25, then it'll be 25. Okay. Is that clear direction, Mr. Weil?
yes.
Okay. Then we'll adjourn. Thank you.